Cold nights and warm fires. Perfect combination of shelter and adversity, right? But for the peasants of the Middle Ages, it was what they endured of days, and something they fought to survive. This video brings you to a time when survival was a fight, and the heat of a fire could mean the difference between living and dying. You're about to sink into the brutal existence of medieval peasants, the back-breaking work, the long cold nights. So, as you watch, consider for a second, what does it mean to survive in such harsh conditions? Tell me some of what you think in the comments as you watch to the finish. I can't wait to find out what you're thinking. The Middle Ages, which lasted from the 5th to the 15th centuries AD, were defined by a wide gulf between the rich and the poor. Kings and lords were living in beautiful castles, safe from the elements, while the peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, were forced to endure living conditions we either can barely imagine today at all, or can only associate with third world countries. The winters in particular were brutal. Without the luxury of modern amenities, medieval peasants had to make the most out of what they could grow, hunt, or trade. With only scarce supplies of food, clothing, and housing, each day was a fight to live. The freezing nights of winter was where their hardy nature was most tested. And yet peasants, using a mix of determination and ingenuity, managed to adapt. It's a tale of survival, endurance, and ingenuity. Some of the most difficult problems confronting peasants were harsh winters in medieval Europe. As the seasons passed, life on a peasant's farm was now not merely how you worked, but how you survived. In the summer, there was always work to be done, planting new crops, bringing in the harvest, readying for colder days to come. But after the first frost set in, the real battle started. Peasants, who were able to easily obtain enough to live on by hunting or farming, were not as used to the hard discipline as the wealthy could avoid wearing tavern clothes. However, they lived in thatched cottages, with little defense against freezing winds, poorly insulated, and often shared with animals. They would freeze at night, no central heating available, nowhere to take cover from the cold other than by the hearth. The fire that was with us day and night for the harsh months became a lifeline for warmth and survival. Even that fire, however, was not without its own trials. Wood had to be chopped and stored early, and it was not a question of whether to gather wood when the frost comes. Nearby forests could easily be wiped out through clearing via firewood collection during the lengthy winter months. Peasants had to save the stories, since if the wood ran out before spring, the biting cold would have no cease. The hearth's welcome blaze might keep the frost at arm's length within the cottage, but it was never able to altogether elude the twinkling demeanor of the cold that waited without dot in its warmth. People found a measure of comfort, but it also presented threats. The bad lighting had an awful potential for accidents, uncontrolled flames, smoke inhalation, and, perhaps, burning the wooden homes down. And yet the gamble was often worth it, for the fire was also what cooked the food that nourished the family and was the heart of social life within the home. The cold and the darkness of the long nights were separated by the warmth of the hearth, where families would commune stories, and sometimes their small sustenance. Peasants' reliance on their fire was not only physical, but also deeply cultural. It stood for survival, for community, for the promise of spring. Around the fire was where the struggle of daily life played out. But as resilient as the fire was meant it to be, peasants remained vulnerable to the many hazards of winter. The cold was more than just a discomfort. It was a killer, capable of claiming the lives of the most vulnerable among us. As winter set in, smelling a rat became an immediate issue for the peasants. The primitive Mek nights were as unkind to the body as they were to any sustenance. All summer would be spent in preparing, harvesting, and storing, but the methods of storage in those days left much to be desired. Barns and silos were used as storage, but they were frequently not well sealed, plagued by cold air and rodents. The freezing conditions might reduce a well-stocked grain supply to a moldy, unusable mess, and cause hunger. Those crops that did survive the cold were limited root vegetables, such as turnips, cabbage, and carrots, were among the hardiest, and they were not going to hold out much longer in storage. The worst of it was that there was the danger that the food stores would run out before the new spring crop. Without refrigeration and few preservation methods, the peasants were left to ration their food, eating progressively smaller amounts. As the winter waned, livestock offered another important source of food, especially protein. But the circumstances were far from ideal. Animals were also exposed to the bitter cold, and thousands of them were being held in the same type of shelters as the people, a potential breeding ground for disease. Cows, sheep, and chickens would often freeze to death. Others weakened because of a lack of feed or care. For the more fortunate few who lived near forests or hunting grounds, there was hunting for game, but even that was never assured. Many of the peasants lacked the tools and ability to hunt the larger game, and smaller, such as rabbits and pheasants, were both rare and elusive. Peasants were resourceful. However, hunters, by contrast, would make use of everything from the meat to the bones, fat and organs that they could to eat, and turn into tools or clothing. Everything was eaten, with nothing being carelessly cast aside. Similarly, when food was scarce, there were still always ways to stretch meals. Bread made from grains to pour to sell, or stew from scraps of meat and vegetables. They learned to make a meal, feed them as far as possible, and to make the little they had count for the most. For those in the hinterland, trade was a matter of life and death. If a family's food stores were running low, it might trade with neighbors or local markets for flour, fish, or preserved meats. But doing so often meant laying down what precious little it had, perhaps a treasured possession or a week's work for a sack of grain. But those deals weren't a given, especially when bad weather made transportation difficult and disrupted trade routes. The roads would freeze, rendering the transport of goods far slower or impossible. A routine transaction could turn into a life-and-death gamble when clobbering snowstorms or an icy sheen of freezing rain delayed shipments of food. But like most everything else related to medieval life, whether a family survived the grueling winter months came down to a combination of luck, preparation, and sheer determination. The fittest families, the most robust and resilient among them, would be the ones with the best chance of pulling through the winter. Not because they possessed more resources even in the best of times. Resources were often thin, but because they knew how to do more with less. They were used to scarcity and the psychological toughness that came from facing it, year in and year out. For others, though, the cold would have been too much. The old, the weak, and the very young suffered most, and often could not survive the harsh times through which they were passing. A family might lose a member because they literally could not stay warm, or because food ran out before the spring harvest. Warmth was also provided by the fire in the hearth, but warmth could not stave off the slow decay from hunger and maladies. By now they accommodated each other. It was also part of their survival reflex that they shared whatever food was available, slept huddled up with one another to keep out the biting cold, and helped out in the task of looking after the weak in the kind of collective solidarity that defined medieval peasant society. And yet, no amount of helping one another over these formidable obstacles could keep cold and hunger at bay. In addition to the cold and the hunger, the medieval peasants were at constant threat of disease. Conditions in the winter seasons of medieval Europe were ripe for disease development and peasant. Living quarters facilitated rapid transmission. Between the constant battle for heat, even the cramped quarters, bad hygiene, and less than ideal medical knowledge all combined to make a perfect storm for illness. The most frequent ailments during wintertime were, not surprisingly, respiratory infections such as influenza or pneumonia, which could escalate rapidly to a fatal illness. Freezing temperatures would make it hard to keep warm even by the fire, and the smoke in the house, pouring from ill-ventilated hearths, would irritate the lungs and bring on illness. The older people, young children, who were naturally more susceptible to the cold, suffered most, and many were killed by the inclemency of the weather. Peasants also suffered through the winter with an inadequate diet, which lowered their resistance to diseases. Their bodies had so few fresh vegetables and fruits that they didn't have the nutrients they needed to prevent infection. The malnutrition from a monotonous diet surely did not help the overall health of the cavemen. The most deadly disease of the Black Ages was the plague, more specifically the Black Death, which swept through Europe at least several times during the era of the Middle Ages. These outbreaks often began in hard winter months when people crowded into overheated and often overcrowded homes to stay warm, ideal conditions for the spread of diseases. The rats that cohabitated with peasants also were infested with fleas, harboring the killing bacterium Yersinia pestis, the plague culprit. The fleas would bite people, transporting the disease and helping account for the high death counts. In an era where medical science was unsophisticated and most of the people were treated for diseases with either herbal remedies or superstitions. The peasants had no chance of effectively controlling these illnesses. Perhaps the village healer or wise woman had some insight into which herbs could alleviate common complaints, but their cures would offer little improvement. Mostly peasants just had to endure and hope they would not become a victim of disease. If the rich peasants could get to a town or city, they might have found a physician, but to all the poor peasants, a doctor was as much out of reach as to have a watch. Despite the severity of these conditions, a family losing 2 members over the winter was not uncommon. The cold, the hunger, the diseases conspired to mix a lethal cocktail, which surfaced at anyone, irrespective of age or stamina. For these peasant families, the constant fear of death was a tremendous weight, and it shaped their lives in very significant ways. Death was always closer to hand, and the peasants knew it. This understanding gave rise to a very superstitious and religious culture. Millions of peasants sought solace in their religion, praying to God, or even the saints, to save them from the winter's numerous dangers. Church services, though infrequent and several hours of rough travel away for many in remote areas, provided a place of hope and a community. One of the use of the church was also as a place where the peasants could get alms or charity when in serious need, but the church's offerings were frequently inadequate, and many peasants believed that they had only one another and their own ingenuity to rely on. If faith loomed large in his/her daily activities, so did his/her bond with the land. The land, even cruel and tough as it was their life. It's what kept them alive in summer, provided crops to harvest, animals to tend, and firewood to burn. Between the peasants and the land, it was a relationship of constant negotiation, of working with the cycles and rhythms of the earth, struggling at moments to master it, at others yielding to its capricious forces. In the winter, these folkland connections were matters of life and death. The snow held fast, the ground froze hard, and there was no more living off the land. It was a time of waiting, waiting for the snow to melt, waiting for the first signs of spring, waiting for the life of the earth to be reborn. Days were longer, nights were blacker, and the future was murky. But the peasants hung on, expecting, with the arrival of spring, the world would be discounted, and with it, their claims to life. Yet as the seasons changed once more and spring arrived, it gave medieval peasants little respite from the struggle for survival. The melting earth, while a metaphor for rejuvenation, was also a source of trouble. The ground had to be worked, the seed sown, and the animals tended. The cold had left a trail of complications to resolve: compacted soil from ice, broken fences, and in some cases no tools with which to even start their task. In early spring, peasants would properly get to start prepping for the summer between trying to fix winter's damages. It always had been a high-stakes time, the short window for planting crops. The peasants were pressed for time and worked hard and well to have the grain and vegetables and legumes into the ground before the summer heat arrived. But this task was not easy. The soil, wet from the melting snow, could easily be too soggy for proper tilling, or it might be too cold for certain crops to thrive. The new planting season could always fail, and families returned to dependence on the thin stalks they have left from the last year. Care of the livestock was also an ongoing worry. The thaw during springtime granted some relief, but it also came to be the time the animals that had been living in the barns all winter were released loose onto the fields. This interim period was dangerous. Many of the animals had been crammed into small, dark spaces for months, and were weak and vulnerable after the long cold months. Some would die of exposure and disease when they were ushered back out into the open. What's more, the spring grass wasn't always as instantly plentiful, meaning some animals were simply still in danger of starving. The health of crops and animals was an ever-present concern, particularly for those with smaller landholdings and fewer resources. There was no guarantee that spring would bring good weather, and if the rains were too heavy or the sunshine too scant, the peasants could suffer another meager harvest. Farmers were at the mercy of nature's whims. Too much rain would flood their fields, too little would leave them dry and barren. Of such elements as sunlight and rain dependent on the will of the Almighty, these simple people were entirely helpless, for if the crops failed, they had little else to fall back on. To make sure their crops persevered, peasants frequently resorted to tried and tested methods of agriculture that had been passed down from their forebears. If you want to maintain the health of your soil, planting the same kind of crop year after year will get you into deep fertilization or natural soil amendments, so you don't deplete the nutrients in the soil. Rotation of crops was a big thing, for example, but crop rotation itself was a luxury many couldn't afford, because it meant having enough land to support alternate crops, as well as a sufficient workforce to cultivate them. Some of those with tiny amounts of arable land were forced to sow on whatever they could and hope for the best. In times of want, peasants would also plant crops that weren't necessarily best suited to their regions or their climates, assuming that if they got a good enough harvest, it would enable them to live for another season. But in the spring, despite the uncertainty, a shared experience of being peasants became a stronger bond between people. They would collaborate in clearing fields, planting the seeds and protecting their crops from pests or weather. This solidarity was essential not only for the task at hand, but morale-wise. Solidarity amongst peasants allowed them to survive the vicissitudes of daily existence. One form of exchange was labor for food or other goods. One family might help another family with plowing fields in exchange for a bit of grain or take a share in the harvest. Faith had a major influence in these community initiatives. Spring planting was an article of faith for many peasants. They prayed for better weather, good harvests, and relief from diseasedom. Yet as peasants planted their crops, they had faith that their prayers and labor would result in a crop that would feed them for the year. A good harvest was interpreted as a sign of the favor of God, while a bad crop was considered a punishment or a trial of faith. But even with all of that in place, the risks of failure never went away. The fragility of peasants' existence haunted them. The cold and long nights and warm fires of winter had passed, but the grim struggle for existence went on. End of the Project Gutenberg ebook, Life and Adventures of Colonel Daniel Boone, *. This file should be named boone10.txt or boone10.zip. Corrected editions of our ebooks get a new number. boone11.txt versions based on separate sources get new letter. boone10a.txt. Produced by an anonymous Project Gutenberg volunteer. Each year came with its own obstacles, from the vagaries of the weather to the possibility of disease or famine. For the peasants, survival was a prolonged test of endurance, one in which they had to depend on their own resilience, their faith, and, perhaps most of all, their communities. Life for the medieval peasants was not without its hardships, and as the summer heat began to build and the crops grow for peasants, things were just as much a struggle. It was therefore perhaps not surprising that while the harvest season could be a time of hope, it could also be a time of hard, grueling labor. The peasants' existence during these months was long days in the fields, commonly from sunrise to sunset. It was hard, physically taxing work, with little opportunity to rest. Summer was a time of life or death for the peasant farmer, for the crops harvested in the late summer and early fall would have to last through the winter. The problem wasn't only in planting but in making sure everything reached full maturity. Farmers were forever fighting pests, human and animal, which threatened their crops. The birds would swoop to grab seeds or delicate shoots. Burrowing animals scuttled through the fields gnawing stored grain. Alongside these external threats, peasants also had to fear still more unpredictable ones in the form of weather hailstorms. Drought or flooding could wipe out a crop in a day. When it came time to pick the crops, the pace picked up. The grain needed to be harvested and threshed and stored. Vegetables and fruit had to be preserved for winter consumption. Peasants would harvest using simple tools like sickles, flails, and scythes, and it was labor-intensive with entire families or entire villages pitching in. In fact, the harvest could last weeks, depending on the type of crop, and the work was arduous. Food preservation was also another important challenge for peasants on the summer hours. In the era before refrigeration, keeping food stored was critical for surviving the long winter months. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and beets might be stored in cool cellars or pits. Fruits and berries could be dried or made into preserves. Meat, likewise, would be smoked or salted, and fish dyed or pickled. Preserving food was a critical process. People consumed seasonal food and needed to ensure whatever surplus would not deplete before next year's crops could be harvested. However, despite the toil, the summer months were a time of ease. For the peasants, after the darkness of winter, the summer's heat made things a bit easier. The children were cold and hungry too, but they were laughing and not crying as much. Thanks to the longer days of work and even a brief bit of playing in the evenings, Long days of labor in the fields typically led to a simple meal, bread and cheese, with some preserved meat or vegetables, shared inside around the crackling stove or out in the sunshine to warm up after a long day. But although the summer brought some respite, the upcoming autumn was still perilous. There was no guarantee of a harvest, and if the winter came, the family would suffer. The food growers mattered very much. A bad harvest was a struggle to make it through another season of cold, starvation, and sickness. Even a small change in the weather could result in devastating crop failures that could perpetuate misery. If it's a wet summer, mildew can ruin grain stores, or a dry summer might prevent the growth of large enough crops to feed the population. It was a perpetual dice rolling that had the peasants in the hands of capricious powers more often than not. Contrary to the struggles, it was in these summer weeks that the community spirit boomed. The peasants leaned on each other not only to assist in doing the work, but also to share in what it produced. Feasts and celebrations of harvests have occurred in some form since the dawn of civilization, when early humans were likely to store food for the winter. Such miracles brought some much-needed respite for the downtrodden. It was an opportunity for peasants to gather and hear tales of overcoming adversity, with which they could relate, and to forget the misery they lived in, give or take a few moments. Perhaps the greatest resource for a peasant was the sense of community, whether they needed to share meals, work together to ripen the harvest, or just get the support they needed when times got hard. They had to rely on each other in order to survive. In one respect or another, a family's survival was not only dependent on them, but also on their village. Communities were social safety nets, providing support and companionship in a world where survival was anything but certain. But as the end of summer waned under the approach of autumn, in the minds of the peasants again there rose the cloud of the threatening winter. Harvests could go bad, disease could sweep through. Another long, cruel winter could again force them to stake everything on survival. As the fall wore on, and as the harvest was brought in, the peasants had one of their most important duties to perform: getting ready for the coming winter. Autumn was a time for painstaking work, because it was the final opportunity to guarantee that winter's subsequent cold and hunger could also have something to survive on. Although it was an immense relief to have the food that had accumulated during the summer harvests, the possibility of want was always before us, and everything felt urgent. There was no limit to the autumn fitness. The autumn work was unending. On their land, peasants stored grains, drying them and grinding them to make bread and other staples. Some would harvest the last of their vegetables, cabbages, pumpkins, etc., for immediate eating, while others would start the long experiment of pickling or preserving. Meat, too, could be processed at this time, if you owned a pig or two, for many families would do so. You would slaughter him in the fall. If he didn't pick up a fatal disease first, and you'd salt it down or smoke it. Once, if a pig was slaughtered, it would yield meat that could last for many months, and its fat could be made into lard for cooking or soap. But not all crops were so easy to save, and not all villagers had the smarts or equipment to store food well. That was where the divide in wealth and resources became most visible. The wealthier peasants, or those with larger estates, were also more likely to have better access to food storage techniques, more space to store it, and enough money to buy extra food. By contrast, among the poorer peasants, or those with little land to farm, their resources remained limited, so they had to get on by whatever means were available to them. This sometimes involving riskier practices or greater dependence on unequal social networks. During the same time, the land itself was also being made ready for the winter. Fields were turned under to allow the land to rest, and fences were mended, as the need to keep animals from scavenging for food in the harsh winter was always a concern. Hunting parties in certain regions would trap or hunt game in nearby woods to prepare for the cold months. This added yet another layer of challenge to the autumn labor, which now demanded that peasants bring their farms into a state of control, while simultaneously conducting their hunt for meat and other supplies. If they had been successful hunting, perhaps it would contain the food they sorely needed, but that scarcity of game only compounded the pressure and anxiety of the winter to come. With this readiness for survival also arose the realization that winter was its inevitable counterpart, and the last few months of the year would once more wear out its homespun. Fall was a reminder that we would be living off those reserves of summer for only so long if we didn't manage them carefully. The first frost, in late September or October at the earliest, would mark the beginning of a harsh cycle that would suck dry the peasants' energy, spirit, and hope. Autumn was also a time of year when the peasants' labors were diminished, if not entirely absent. Following Sanxia's festival, as the days drew shorter and the nights grew cooler, those of the village could take more time from gathering and storing food in relative anticipation that winter would not easily claim them, and concentrate on domestic matters. In the northern fields, mending clothes, fixing tools and mending the roof before the winter mines closed were some of the most important tasks. A family would freeze for the winter by losing the ability to size, sew or patch up old clothes. One torn-up cloak or old pair of boots could be the difference between the other side of winter and taking a long nap in the snow. Peasant families, for example, huddled around the hearths after dark to cook their last meals of the season. Days of quiet and rest. Of fear, too, he observed. How long would we have food? Would the firewood be enough? Would the snowstorms be early or late? Could the family endure yet another season? The community, too, once more came to occupy a central position in these months. Among peasants, people depended on one another for all sorts of things, kindling and food, and simply company during their long, dark evenings. When one's family fell into hard times, the village would often arrive to help. They knew that living was not solitary, but was, rather, communal. The binding links that held these villages together were from centuries of shared experience. During those dark autumn months, farmers relied on each other, feeding a little of whatever they could spare to see all families through. Winter's apprehension was never quite relieved. Despite the collective support, the cold was not only an irritant, it was a killer, able to tear families apart, give away homes and steal hope. As each week of autumn passed by, even in a week of warmth, they felt that they were coming nearer to the time when, like rich and poor, they would feel the bitter cold of winter. Once winter set in, the strength of a medieval peasant was put to the test. The long cold nights which had been threatening us were now a reality. The air grew icy, and daylight dwindled to almost none, affording the serfs scant time to get anything done outside the home. Now the labor was the clay labor, not in the fields or with the animals, but wholly in the creation of the means of physical survival in the house. While the hearth fire gutted feebly against the intolerable cold, the fight for warmth and nourishment escalated, and as the winter winds swept through the desolate terrain, the land turned into a bleak, frozen wasteland. With the earth disappearing under a coat of snow, the peasants were back in their log-stained homes, with nothing much to do except gather close to the fire and pray the food would last. With roads clogged by snow, they were cut off from the outside world. Marketplaces that had been bustling until days before were quiet and dead trade. In winter there was an awful silence, only to be disturbed at times by the howl of some animal in the distance or by a violent tempest. First priority was to keep the fire burning. One tiny spark was all that separated the peasants from suffocating cold. Not only did the fire provide warmth, but it was a necessity for cooking, drying clothes and ensuring the house was fit for habitation. But the firewood he had so painstakingly saved throughout the months was all but gone. They'd hoarded what they could, but there'd been so much need for heat these long nights. Fires had to burn on simple hearths day and night, and keeping up with the chopping of wood for them was exhausting. For the peasant, the job of keeping the fire burning was frequently the same sort of labor that dominated their lives. Once the fire decelerated, and the cold struck back at the alum house, then the scene turned desperate rapidly. No fire, no food, cooking was impossible, and the warmth needed to fight the cold was absent. That made firewood not just a necessity, but a lifeline. During the worst winters, some peasants would go to extreme lengths, burning furniture or anything they could afford to keep the fire alive. At times like these, it had been plain to see that nothing else mattered save living. The cold carried with it yet another danger, the risk of health falling apart. The aged, the infirm, and the infant were the most exposed to the winter. Sufferings, pneumonia, frostbite, and other cold-related ailments could be lethal if not treated properly. But lacking modern medicine, in an era when advanced treatments were unavailable, the loss of a family member could be an all too predictable event, and indeed it was. The hard truth was that the cold would itself slowly take the most vulnerable. But it was the absence of food that most terrified those left shivering in the frozen world. This time, though, the food that had been stored up in the autumn was now starting to run out. The bread and jerked meats, the dried fruits, and vegetables all seemed to vanish with the inexorable flow of time. Plates of food kept getting smaller and rationing wasn't an option. It was life or death. Peasants had little to eat and would scrounge for anything to eat. A few would try hunting in the frozen terrain, but the heavy snow made tracking game nearly impossible. Others tried their livestock, killing what animals they could in the barns. The more fortunate may have some hens or sheep to slaughter for their families, but many of them lost animals to the cold or disease earlier in the season. During these times, many peasants relied on what was available to them: wild plants, roots from the frozen ground, anything they could scavenge. But scavenging alone wouldn't last them long. In the hardest winters, starvation was a genuine possibility, and try as they might to save food, there was ever the possibility of running out of it before the softening of the spring came. The desperate search for food could also create frictions between families and villages, as competition for rare resources occasionally resulted in conflict or stealing. The work had slowed to a crawl by December, and the cold had begun to permeate every facet of life. Yet survival was not the only thing to occupy life in these dark months, and even in such difficult times it was possible to find joy. Winter's dark had some time to think, some peace and quiet, though graced from time to time with fear, with uncertainty. And inside their homes, families spent hours wrapped in front of the fire, storytelling musician, ritual performer, listening to tales, singing, praying. Inspired by these long nights, peasants took comfort in the warmth of each other's company. The common struggle for survival emerged as an empowering bond, the only glimmer of hope and solidarity. Amidst the suffering, the winter also saw the peasants performing their religious duties. With other events of their lives beyond their control, many sought solace in their faith. Series of church services punctuated the winter, as peasants attempted to express hope and solace in the belief that a better future awaited them. Prayer was an everyday thing, especially with the winter almost upon the herd with seemingly no remedy. But ultimately, as much as they prayed, as much as they worked, as much as they stood up and fought back, the peasants were at the mercy of nature's wrath. They understood that every winter was unique, and that some would be more gentle, while others would test them with all their might. Some families would be wiped out, still others would surmount it, but just barely. The tightrope between life and death, between survival and failure, was always a precarious one. For peasants, each successive winter underscored how precarious life could be. The peasant's sense of time increasingly became one that was defined by cycles of survival, not leisure or ease. As the winter wore on, the days were long and cold, and remarkably routine, one after the other. Surviving monotony dragged on them. The seasons had their rhythms, but winter, in particular, could feel interminable. The hearth's light was one of the few fleeting moments of comfort in a world that seemed to be frozen forever. For the peasants, it was not just the physical ravages that winter wrought, but the mental as well, and the steady weight of uncertainty. Would there be enough food? Could they make it through another season? Was heavy on the mind. Winter, in its cold and its stillness, also brought the unbearable prescience of waiting for the spring thaw, the first thaw to split, the desperate days of rationing to be over. It was a moment when hope and despair felt inextricably linked. For some, there was an even darker side to the winter months, the prospect of starvation. No matter how much the peasants planned, there were always unexpected occurrences: bad weather or a bad harvest, illness among the animals, or some other adversity that could lead to a food shortage. After the last of the preserves were depleted and the grain storehouses stood empty, the villagers lived off whatever wild grasses and tubers remained, sometimes even foraged roots or even tree bark. The cruelest enemy could be the weather itself. Traditional Russian life could be pushy. Harsh winters, blizzards and freezing rain could trap peasants in their huts for weeks, unable to collect firewood or food. And at some villages far from civilization, blocked in by deep snow and downed roads, there was a looming fear of being cut off from the outside world. Routes for trade, through which grain and meat were usually supplied, were blocked. It was in these austere, seemingly never-ending winters that some villagers would starve, or worse. The harsh loneliness and the scarcity of supplies frequently resulted in death, particularly among the elderly, babes and sucklings and such as were already infirm. In the worst of those times, community cooperation was a lifeline. If one family was suffering, the other stepped in, either by sharing the little food they had left, or by contributing to the collection of firewood. But these social bonds, so crucial to survival, could fray even then, in times of such extreme scarcity. Hunger could bring desperation, which would lead to conflict and division. Although peasants generally collaborated with one another, the stress of survival could occasionally lead to competition or even conflict over resources, especially when food grew perilously short. At times there were petty thefts, by people or families taking what they could to survive. Religion and superstitions also became more significant over the long nights of winter. To many of the peasants, in the winter season was the season of retrospect and of reverence. The misery of their existence, coupled with the hardship of the season, only had the tendency to bind them more to their religious faith. Church services were a refuge for the poor who would go there not just to worship, but to have company. It was the priest's job to occasionally bear messages of hope, to remind them that surviving was testimony to their strength and faith, more than simply religious. Peasant folklore and superstitious beliefs were an essential source of mental and emotional survival during the cold months. To explain the suffering and mysteries of winter, stories of saints and miracles, tales of spirits and the supernatural, were handed down over time. These stories assuaged the peasant's sense of powerlessness, even when that powerlessness was all too real. The idea that certain rituals or prayers might lessen the threat of evil spirits or guard against famine provided them with some solace in their otherwise deeply uncertain lives. They toasted to the dark and cold nights, which, this time, the traditions flourished. The colder and darker it grew on the outside, the more did the fire in the hearth become a picture of life, for it was the heart of everything: light, warmth, sustenance, sociability. It was where people went to find protection from not only the cold, but the awful, searing solitude of winter. Families gathered to tell tales, share whatever food remained, and even to plan for the future. Every so often small, intimate meetings would be held on long evenings, where neighbors would gather to pray, sing, or talk. The feeling of mutual caring was key to survival because it helped people muster the strength to live one more day. For all their misery, and the sense of time dragging and physical exhaustion from the struggle to keep themselves fed and warm, the peasants also knew that they needed to keep going. They were used to hardship. It molded them. It molded their communities. Each spring held a faint promise, but they never got their hopes up. Winter was always waiting. The bitter winter nights were an icy reminder of their fragility, yet amazing resilience. Day by day, as the days grew longer and the first few flowers began to show themselves, the common people knew that the worst was over, but the memory of winter's trials would remain with them a long while. With each season came new dangers, but it also served as a reminder that the simple truth was survival was never a given. It was a delicate, ongoing battle. The spring, it was as cold as winter, but the ice began to break, and the peasants crept stiffly out of their hovels, worn out by months of close confinement. And with the first warm days came a host of new pressures as well. A suddenly warming ground and a new wetness indicated that the fields had to be plowed, that seeds had to be sown, that the animals had to be cared for. These activities requiring a great deal of energy and time. But despondent though the working people were after the cold fatigue of the winter months, there was a glimmer of something better as they went back into the fields. Between winter and spring was always a whirl of activity, a race against time, to get the crops in before the growing season had passed by. The peasants were aware that the bitter winter had ravaged their fields. The soil, still cold and wet from the melting snow, proved more resistant to the plough, and many of the old tools had worn out or broken down. The work of preparing the ground for sowing was terrible, and many of the peasants needed their neighbors to prepare it for them. Community labor was more necessary than ever, in that families required all hands to complete the task. The peasants, apart from their fields, also concentrated upon the houses and cattle. The winter had taken a heavy toll on their animals, and many families had lost cows, sheep or pigs to the cold, disease or starvation. It was a delicate balancing act to ensure enough animals survived to provide milk, wool and meat for the new year. Remaining livestock was to be cared for, cleaned and fed as the livestock started their breeding seasons and spring approached. But it was never a certainty that the animals' disease spread rapidly in overcrowded, unsanitary living conditions would flourish, complicating the peasants' work more. Still, There was a general sense of thank God the worst of the winter was behind us. The days lengthened, the sun was on the peasants' backs again. The ground, once solid, frozen as an armor, now softening and becoming open enough to plant seeds and carry crops. This was a time of new beginnings, a time when peasants could anticipate the prospect of a good harvest. But they also knew that the perils of the previous winter were never far away. The memory of hunger, cold, and death lived on in their minds, and they could not allow themselves to forget the precariousness of their own existence. It was also a time when many of the peasants would commence repairing their dwellings, for the spring, the long winter had left cottages vulnerable, with roofs sagging under drifts of snow and walls cracking in the cold. The first warm days gave the opportunity to repair the damage the cold had caused, to make the houses ready for the next season. But with the spring thaw, there was still no assurance that the work would be sufficient. Many peasants were in their winter near-death experiences in both body and soul, and did not feel strong enough to overcome the debris. And with all that draft, the world went on being born, the new animals being born, the crops that would begin to grow, and the people who would start to repair their homes also represented new beginnings. But spring brought its own set of uncertainties. The peasants knew that their survival was precarious, and that the months ahead could bring fresh hardship, always illness, bad weather. Crop failure could burst in upon the work and mend the plans. The spring, so beautiful, was only a reminder that the peasants' battle for existence was like an unbroken wheel, and they'd be back to the hard work of planting, cultivating, and harvesting, back to the pressures of daily life. But there was also something durable, indomitable, in the peasants' capacity to continue, to endure the hard reality into which they were born, faced year after year. The land, in its cycles of death and rebirth, served as a burden and source of hope at the same time. It was the way they survived, and it was a reminder that survival itself was always precarious, always fickle and subject to a world beyond their control. When summer months drew nigh, and when the corn began to grow in good earnest, the toil of the peasants passed into another state of hard labor. The sound of scythes cutting swaths through the grass filled the air, as half a dozen crisscrossed there, swiping at the overgrown vegetation. The days were long with sowing the flax and weeding and caring for the crops, upon which the peasants' fate for the year depended. For many, the summer was the final opportunity to get it right before the harvest and the combined pressure of getting through another year bearing down on them. The sun ensured it wasn't just a time of warmth and prosperity, but also new dangers. We worked ourselves to death, and there was never time to sleep. There was always something that needed to be done, whether it was making sure the animals had adequate food and water, or keeping an eye out for pests that might harm the crops. The summer labor was full-throttled, unrelenting. The work was never done. Soil had to be tended, weeds hoed, plants needed to be looked after all the time. Peasants had been trained to toil for long hours without protest, because their livelihoods depended on it, but it was also a period of brief moments of relief. At the end of a long day in the fields, as the sun began to sink, families gathered in their cottages, worn but waiting. The meals were staid, but the company was dear, and the fire in the hearth was a tangible lozenge of warmth and safety. The evening brought stories, laughter, and even song, as goodly folk sought refuge in one another's company. These were fleeting seconds of respite from the continuous demands of survival. It was a reminder of the power of community, and the vitality that could be found in togetherness. After the labor of summer, however, there remained many perils which might destroy the peasants' means of subsistence. The climate was still uncertain, and the danger of a late frost, a dry spell, or a summer storm ever at hand. These conditions would destroy a whole crop in a couple days. That was because farmers had to be ready for the chance his hard work could be washed away in mere seconds. Fields that were just starting to flower could be wiped out with hail or heavy rain, while stretches of torrid heat would leave fields barren and cracked. Peasants didn't have the margin of error. Each time any such depression of the failures poured on their sensitive existence with redoubled weight, there were also the constant fears of food shortages. Amid the summer's hard labor, leftover stores from the previous harvest were beginning to run out, and the new crops were months away from being ready to harvest. I was always afraid, let's face it, that there wouldn't be enough food. Rationing took on even greater significance as the summer progressed, and the prospect of food scarcity before the next harvest of crops was an alarming one. There was no guarantee that hunger wouldn't come back again before the next harvest could bring relief, where that even in better times a poor harvest or unforeseen events could leave the entire community struggling to survive. As the beginning of the harvesting approached, excitement mounted. The peasants were aware that soon they would receive the fruits of their labor, and that in the success or failure of that crop depended much of their very existence. The crops were a lifeline. Without a successful harvest, there was little hope of getting through the winter. The uncertainty of the month ahead had worn heavily on her, and the expectation to do well was enormous. Crops needed tending to, and, by all accounts, these were busy days of men working in the fields preparing for their winter's supply of food. Failure was not an option. When harvest started, the task of gathering the crops kicked into high gear. The fields would be mowed, the grain taken in, the fruit picked and ready for storage. It was hard day's work, but satisfying hard work. The peasants realized that the satisfaction of their needs in the coming winter depended on this harvest. Every sheaf they could harvest, every wisp of vegetables and every animal they hunted in order to have meat, made it more likely that they would live through the coming lean times. And yet, even in the relief of a good harvest, the peasants knew that they could not rest. The work, in fact, was not done. The barns and homes being filled with the harvest, the crops had to be put away. Firewood was needed for the long winter, and homes had to be fixed and winterized. The labor of survival was never over. It was a never-ending cycle, planting, growing, harvesting, preparing the next season. It wasn't that the summer months, full of labor and all the stress thereof, were for working here and now. They were for working for the future. The peasants knew that if they did not work hard and sacrifice throughout the summer, they would have no hope of surviving the impending winter. Each grain of meal, each vegetable, and each bit of meat gathered in this way was the foundation of the support of life during the long months which must intervene before we could have hope of help. Summer, he said, was a season of hope and anxiety, when the work of survival was most difficult and most necessary. When the days grew shorter and the final summer harvest was brought in, the peasants would be again forced to confront the unavoidable approach of autumn. Chilly, bracing air started to sneak in, and the bustling farms would settle down. The cycle that was so grueling and felt so uncertain was about to close. The wasps had been gathered in, and it was time to make ready for the long, cold months. The fall was a relief in many ways, but also an uneasy reminder of the tenuousness of survival. The peasants knew that, although they themselves had earned their harvest through hard labor, the labor was not yet over. The work extending the bounty throughout the winter was still to be done, getting what they harvested into some kind of storage. The real slog of survival started during those years. The harvest was the easy part. Preserving was what would determine if the family would survive the long winter. Food preservation was certainly not easy. It was about planning ahead, and about hard work, and about knowing what would last through the cold months. Crops such as grains had to be stored in cool, dry locations, frequently in barns or granaries that were built specifically for that purpose. Vegetables, if they could remain edible, were to be dried, pickled, or stored in root cellars. Meats were salted, smoked or salted, and fish was smoked or salted for preservation. Everything had to be exactly right, as any slip in preservation would mean spoilage and the waste of precious food. Along with preserving food, the peasants also took care of their homes and readied their farms for the winter ahead. The thatched roofs had taken a beating from summer rains and needed to be repaired. The fireplaces needed to be cleaned and would stacked for the winter months. Each job was important, for on one mistake they were aware that inattention from work could cause them to burn to the ground. Even their work would not save them from the winter they would find so overpowering. The community was, again, instrumental in the preparation. Neighbors assisted one another at harvest time with the preservation of food and in the reconstruction of homes. They bartered labor for goods, creating even stronger ties between families and neighbors. The community spirit was more than a matter of tradition. It was a matter of survival. Other households, also individual, marooned and blocked from seeking help, could find themselves ruined. But collectively, the peasants were more powerful, and winter felt less like a place of isolation. However light the autumn made their daily task, the peasants were aware that the worst of their troubles had yet to arrive. The winter, so bitterly cold, was ever present and a threat. The days were shortening, the nights lengthening, and the first frost caused the earth itself to feel frozen in such a manner that the peasants themselves seemed cut off from the inherent order of nature. The green fields of yore had either been swept over by snow or sidereous earth. There was no work to be done in the fields, only the long wait for spring. During this interval of suspense, there was relaxation and there was tension. Now the peasants could retreat to their homes, sit beside the fire, and have some small comfort in the season. But they were also intimately acquainted with the fragility of their existence. They understood that the food they had set aside would have to last, and that the severity of winter would challenge them. The cold months were a time to reflect on the past year's losses, and a time when inevitability set in. The peasants would live or die according to the productiveness of those fateful months. Autumn, in many ways, was the quiet before the storm. It was a final chance to get ready, to mend, to present to the mind, in retrospect, what the clapper had worn down. It was a period of reflection for the peasants. Sitting by the fire, they would recall the year, the trials they had suffered, the adversities which had confronted them side by side, the harvest, the work, the fears of hunger. That was all part of a cycle that had repeated for generations. The peasants knew that their survival depended not only on hard work, but also on faith, endurance, and often good fortune. And though the land appeared tranquil in these autumn days, the people of the peasants' homes were anything but quiet. They knew winter was coming, and with it the struggle for survival. When the cold gales started to blow and the first snows fell, the peasants gathered for warmth and solidarity, knowing that the worst of the year still lay ahead. When winter settled upon the country, the question of rescue lapsed away from being a problem of work to the simply physical problem of enduring on. In the months prior, the peasants had taken every measure to protect against the cold. But now they were at nature's mercy and her wrath. The snow grew deeper and deeper, and the ground was smothered in a deep, white sheet of silence. The gusts of wind rumbled, the cold, icy gusts surging through the trees, ruffling the hay on the thatched roofs. The daylight had receded, and the streets and fields outside the houses were an unforgiving white desert of frozen land on the walls of the rugged cottages. The hearth fire was the domestic seat of life. It was the steady presence, the source of warmth, light, and nutrition. As long as the fire was alive, so were the peasants able to delay the cold. But an ever-burning fire still had to be tended to. The wood needed to be collected, the kindling arranged, and the hearth maintained just so. Even the tiniest misstep, let the fire go out, miscalculate the woodpile, or fail to protect it from the rain, might condemn you to a cold so intense it could freeze you in the night. The space inside was tight, enclosed, kowtow landing even in modest, small homes. You would have so many people in them, and some of their animals could come inside for heat, he said. Goats, chickens, pigs, and occasionally cows were left near the fire to shield them from the outside cold. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke, food and stock. The family and their animals may have been kept warm, but the setup was a huge associated health risk. The air was frequently smoky, and the overcrowding provided for rapid disease transmission. Respiratory ailments were a constant threat, and diseases that could have been regarded as survivable in warmer months could prove fatal during the winter. For the peasants, however, the struggle of winter wasn't just to keep warm, it was to keep hope and life alive. They knew that the fire, the stores of food, the warmth on which they had fought so desperately to maintain was finite. Now that the provisions were starting to run out, they really had no options but to wait. The first suggestion of want was cause for alarm in the home. The bread was going stale, the salt meat was all but gone, and the few root vegetables remaining were dwindling fast. By the time dead of winter descended, the peasants were already dreaming of spring and stretching their rations to the best of their ability. COVID-19, Ilse's worst fear this long months. Yes, the food stores empty. There was no way to replenish supplies before the thaw, and hunger was a perpetual presence. Bread and salted meats could sustain them only for so long, and eventually even their preserved rations would run out. Should the crops from the previous year not prove sufficient, or if the harvest had not been effectively preserved, famine could ensue. The toughest winters were not the ones of icy cold, when food ran short too soon and villagers lived on what little they could find by foraging or hunting, perhaps picking through snow-covered fields for roots or dried herbs. The physiological pain of hunger was coupled with a mental one. The poor peasants cowered around their fire through the days and made the best of the little they had. Talk was of hope for spring. whether the crops would thrive, and whether the harvest would be enough to see another winter. There were challenges to every season, but winter often felt like the hardest one. The cold chilled the blood and marrow of the citizens, and wore them out day by day. They eked out a cautious existence, keeping a watch on the wood, the food, and the health of their family, while the peasants spent so much of the winter concentrating on the necessities of survival. The dark, quiet months were also a season for contemplation. The severity of the circumstances frequently caused the peasants to turn inward and pray. But as much as they were controlled by nature's cycles, planting, harvesting, preserving, they were also deeply rooted in their faith. With the long, cold nights, religion was a source of comfort. Those who wouldn't sell their land, or crumbled under fair religious pressure to do so, now prayed that God, the saints, or divine intervention might carry them through the worst. Extra church services would be held in certain villages, the people meeting not only for worship, but for praying for deliverance from the severe weather, the long dark nights, and along with it the ticking of time. As the months passed and the cold dragged on into what seemed like an eternity of winter, peasants would scratch the days off their calendars, eager for the first fleeting hints of spring. If only the spring would come, the end of the tunnel, a new beginning, a fresh start. But the wait was endless, and the peasants had found that in their world, nothing was predictable. The cycles of the earth were always uncertain, and it was always possible for one season to wreak ruin. In this dark period, the continued vitality of the peasantry came once again to have enormous importance. Families were sharing whatever little food there was. In the barter system, neighbors began trading what food or firewood they did have. This unity of suffering was one of the few things the peasants had going for them. They were also aware that survival was never a solo operation, it was a collective one. In their moments of desperation, they put their trust in one another, helping each other out and giving what little they had, so as to not leave anyone behind. Throughout the direst of winters, as the peasants of Jamsbury Angels felt the icy temperatures begin to secede and an early bright glimpse of spring peeped over the horizon, the humans' lives were encapsulated in one common goal: to be alive, long enough to see the thaw. The long imprisoning and chilly months of confinement had taken the edge off their energy, but the hope of warmer days was never long out of their thoughts. The peasants, toughened by another frosty winter, already waited for the first spring symptoms of the new life, like the first shades of green on the trees, the thawing snow, and the gradual softening of the frozen soil. But the spring didn't come with any fast relief. The thaw was gradual and full of uncertainties. The first few days of spring were ill at ease. The ground was still too cold to work, and the cold winds could chill even the most snugly prepared of homes. The peasants had learned not to count on any season being less harsh than the last, and while the cold had already taken to its heels, the spring had its own trick up its sleeve. The first duty of the peasants was to take stock of the injuries inflicted by the winter. The houses, while sturdy against the elements, frequently bore the marks of the harsh months. The roofs sustained damage when the snow caused them to sag or leak. They needed to restock the woodpile. Food had to be rationed thoroughly, since new crops would not be available for several months. But the most immediate need was always to turn over the earth. The spring means planting, and the harvest's success this year would rely entirely on the state of the land. The fall of winter had been spent mending tools and sharpening sickles that, once again, would be used to sow the seeds that would feed their families. The thaw sometimes left the fields muddy and unsettled and hard to plough. The peasants' lives were needful, backbreaking, but they raced at an unchronicled pace by these monasteries. Every day mattered. The plants had to be in the ground as soon as possible before the next menace, whatever it was, whether storms, pests, drought, could swoop in to foil their labors. Yet the peasant worked in hope. The start of spring was a confirmation that they had survived another year, and though survival could never be guaranteed, planting something again was a time of potential. The peasants knew that the land offered the prospect of a new life, even as they experienced the burden of previous seasons. There was always that burn of hope still there, even in the uncertain times. The peasants shared their labor, knowledge and resources as they combined to work in their villages. The early months of spring were times of neighborly cooperation. Neighbors helped each other plant, they cleared land together, and they pitched in to fix each other's houses. And the bonds of community, so vital in a brutal winter, were reignited in spring. It was still hard work, but but there was strength in numbers. Also, in these spring months, the peasants took stock of themselves and their animals. Though some animals had survived the winter, many had died from the cold or hunger. The animals that survived had to be tended to, nursed back to health if they were injured or sick, and made ready for summer. Like the crops, the health of the livestock was critical. Animals were a food source, a source of labor with which to cultivate crops, a mode of transportation, and raw materials for clothing and shelter. The loss of even one cow or goat might mean ruin for a family. But even as peasants toiled in the fields and with their livestock, the remnants of winter's privations persisted. They had the first spring harvest, but food was still an urgent dearth. The stores of the previous winter were commonly nearly expended by the time that spring came. Practically, the peasants had to eat their foodstuffs in doses, while waiting for the first crops could be collected. It was a time of careful equilibrium, of counting every meal and preparing every task with an eye on the future. The coming of spring represented a relief and a round of the peasants' lives. They stayed alive through yet another winter, but the planting, growing and harvesting cycle was about to be repeated. The peasants knew that there would never be an easy season, and living was a battle for survival. They could put aside the severity of winter, even though one was now over. It was not forgotten. It was new challenges each year, but ways to learn, ways to work together, ways to keep going. Season after season, they were learning to make room for themselves, learning the rhythm of the land, and finding strength in solidarity with others. And as the earth warmed up and first signs of green began to appear, the peasants looked ahead, uncertain. Hopefully, the perils of the winter past were conquered, but all the future was full of contingencies. Wars would arise when crops grew or they didn't. The weather would be favorable, or it wouldn't. But the peasants, veterans of endless seasons, understood that survival was about more than just physical stamina. It was about the importance of clinging to hope, of pulling together and pushing through every season, no matter how challenging. The days got longer and spring roared into gear, and the peasants' attention narrowed to one thing: planting. The work was relentless, and people were so full of energy, in part because this was what might determine whether they would survive the upcoming winter. Every seed sown, every furrow of grain cast into the ground was a personal investment in their upcoming years. The job was physically tough, but also mentally challenging. The peasants were working to the rhythm of the earth, and they knew that timing, care, and attention were everything. Spring planting strained this balance. The usual damp of the winter's snow and the air was at times cold, and the peasants, with all their painstaking labor, found it hard to hit just the right time of sowing. Too early and the cold might stunt the plants. Too late and the growing season would be shortened, which could ultimately impact the crop. Each decision, whether to sow barley, rye, wheat, vegetables, had to be accounted for so precisely. The peasants' data was a mixture of long experience, old tales, and superstition. The old farmers used to say the best harvests happened when the planting took place on a certain phase of the moon or in certain hours of the day. Although these superstitions might appear unscientific, they offered comfort and a feeling of being in control in a world that seemed to revolve around the whims of nature. The early spring months, when the peasants sowed the seeds, were a time filled with optimism and apprehension. The land had finally thawed, but it was still tender. The peasants worked collaboratively with other family members to get the fields ready through weeding and hoeing, often working as families and sometimes in teams, with the children picking up on what the adults did. There wasn't much time for rest. If a field wanted to be furrowed, it must be plowed, and no one could waste hours of sunshine. Diligently they worked from sunrise to sunset, with the expectation of anticipation that prospective gain should follow their labor. But they also knew that hard work was no guarantee of success. A late frost, an unforeseen storm, or an infestation of pests could destroy the crops they had so carefully tended. But the very act of planting was an act of faith. It was a faith in the idea that somehow, just by the side of despair, something would flower, something would hold. The animals, meanwhile, still required care to the remaining animals, who made it through winter, now needed to be looked after to start production cycles for spring. Calves, lambs, piglets were born, the frail determinant of their lives, the peasants' success in feeding and protecting them. The farmers did everything they could to spare the lives of at least some of the animals, but nature once again had its own ways. In this case, diseases could grow out of control. Predators could carry off livestock, and families were left with even less. Even the small animals, chickens and rabbits, offered some relief, but it was the ones that were large by comparison. The livestock that was most crucial to sustaining families. The young animals were the promise of future food, of the labor that would be needed to feed a growing population, and of new land or a spare horse to sell during the lean years that always came in the aftermath of a crop failure or a lost battle. With the first signs of the season's fruit, early berries, tender shoots of greens, baby sprouts of root vegetables, there came also a great sense of relief. These first crops were not sufficient to fully support the peasants, but they gave variety and nutrients to their diet. But the true test would come later, with harvest of most of the crops in late summer and fall. The peasants understood that their year hung in tatters on the sustenance of a good harvest. Without a decent crop, there would be no food next winter, and no amount of hope or work would change that. But as the crops took root and the animals grew, they were full of hope. The farmers, peasants, had survived the long winter, and the circle of life was turning once again. They had survived the worst months together, leaning on one another for support and for survival. Now the sun shone warmly, there was a good prospect of a harvest, and the inhabitants could hope they might live another year. Spring had returned as a reminder that life, as with the land, was cyclical. Cold, hard winters, warm, bountiful summers set the beat of life. The peasants had passed through the season of privation, and now they were keeping step with the pulse of nature. In their hopeful toil to make the seeds they were sowing produce bread to eat in the coming year, every bitter season, every bitter struggle, was softened by the promise of the next turn of the wheel being a stroke of good fortune. Yet the peasants did not lose heart. They'd become used to having to endure, to adapt, to draw strength from the season's never-ending cycle. They were very aware that no matter how bad it got, they knew they could survive it on their own, within their own communities, and with their profound faith in this land. There had never been certainty of survival, but there had always been the possibility, so long as one could endure, to look forward to a promised spring.